The briefing room on Terran Station smelled of recycled coolant and something faintly organic that Overseer Dravathi Kos had never been able to identify in 6 cycles of posting there. She had always assumed it was the ventilation system drawing trace atmospheric compounds from the adjacent biology labs. She was wrong about that, as it turned out, and she would find out she was wrong about it at the end of this day, along with several other things she had been carrying as settled conclusions without ever having checked the source. The 6 seats around the central table were filled before she arrived, which was itself a small irregularity, because the scheduled briefing did not begin for another 11 standard minutes. 5 of those seats held members of her own oversight division staff, all wearing the pale gray of administrative authority, all watching their data pads with the particular focused attention that told Dravathi they had already reviewed the contested assignment file and formed opinions. The 6th seat held the human. She was small. That was the first thing Dravathi registered, because she had attended 2 prior human debriefings, and both humans had been physically substantial in ways that forced involuntary recalibration, all mass and forward-leaning posture, the kind of density that made the air feel occupied differently. This one was compact to the point of appearing fragile. Brown hair pulled back in a functional knot. A lean build that her uniform, standard gray-blue field issue with no rank insignia above corporal, made look even less remarkable. Her hands rested on the table in front of her, both visible, fingers loosely laced, and she was not looking at her data pad. She was looking at the wall to the left of the door. Not at the door, at the wall beside it. Dravathi took her seat at the head of the table and opened her own data pad without acknowledging the human directly. Standard procedure for contested assignment reviews. The subject waited. Her name was Nora Vasquez, Corporal, Human Expeditionary Forces, 3rd cycle of active posting. Age 27 by human reckoning, which placed her in what the human military apparently considered early prime. Her assignment request had come through the standard requisition channels 7 standard days ago, and had immediately produced what Dravathi's superior, Director Thalvin, described as a paperwork anomaly, by which he meant that 3 separate division heads had filed competing objections before anyone had even confirmed the request was genuine. Nora Vasquez had submitted, through the appropriate channels and with all correct authorizations, a request to be assigned as primary navigation advisor for the Keth Corridor Evacuation Planning Committee. The Keth Corridor was 43 inhabited stations and colony installations scattered across a transit zone that the Vraxian expansion fleet had been pushing toward for the past 14 standard months. Evacuation planning for that corridor was among the most complex logistical operations the Galactic Council had ever attempted. The committee handling it included 3 senior fleet strategists, 2 planetary governance specialists, and 1 xenoarchaeologist, whose specific expertise in Vraxian territorial doctrine had been deemed essential. It did not include, and had never previously included, a human corporal. Dravathi had reviewed the objection filings the night before. The first, from Sub-Coordinator Prethis, cited insufficient formal qualifications. The second, from Division Head Soren of Strategic Planning, cited procedural irregularity in the requisition pathway. The third, from the head of the evacuation committee itself, a Solvati fleet veteran named Commander Yeth, cited experience mismatch in terms Dravathi found diplomatically imprecise, which was to say he had written, and she had read twice to confirm she had not misunderstood, that the assignment of a corporal-grade human to a senior planning body was operationally inappropriate given the scale of the undertaking. She had read that sentence 3 times and thought about what scale meant to a person who had presumably served in contexts where scale was measured in hull integrity ratings and weapons locks. She had not arrived at a satisfying answer before morning. The human was still watching the wall when Drivathi sat down. Not with any visible anxiety, not fidgeting, not the taut stillness of someone rehearsing what they plan to say. Just settled, the kind of patience that comes from having spent time in situations where impatience would have cost you something concrete. Corporal Vasquez, Drivathi said. Her translator rendered the name in the flat standard galactic that all formal proceedings required. This review concerns your requisition filing of standard date 44.7. Do you understand the purpose of this session? Yes, Overseer, the human said. Her voice was low and even, not particularly loud, the kind of voice that made you wonder whether you had heard all of it. I've been assigned a contested status pending confirmation of qualifications. That is correct. Drivathi glanced at her staff. Sub-Coordinator Prethis, a Kaldrathi with pale dermis that shifted visibly toward gray when he was skeptical, was already showing a slight gray shift. He had been the first to file an objection. The committee reviewing the Keth Corridor Evacuation Planning Framework represents some of the most specialized expertise available to the Council. Your requisition included a qualifications summary. We are here to assess that summary. The human's hands remained laced. Her eyes moved from the wall to Drivathi without particular urgency. All right, she said. Prethis cleared his throat, which was the Kaldrathi equivalent of tapping a data pad for attention. He was the most procedurally rigorous member of Drivathi's staff and had developed, over 4 cycles of service, a specific vocal modulation for the moments when he felt a proceeding was not moving at the correct pace. He used that modulation now. Your qualifications summary states that you have, and I'm quoting directly, extensive practical experience mapping contested transit corridors under adversarial conditions. This phrasing is not a standard council qualification descriptor. It does not map to any recognized certification category in the database. Can you explain what it means in concrete terms? The human considered that for a moment. Not hesitating, Drivathi noted, not the pause of someone uncertain of their answer, more the pause of someone deciding how much of the answer to give first, calibrating for room and audience. I spent 11 months embedded with a mixed-species civilian convoy running the outer ring of the Scraith occupation zone, she said. We were moving people. Couldn't use the published transit lanes because the Scraith were watching those. So I learned the others. The unpublished lanes, said Prethis. The ones that hadn't been published yet, the human said. There's a difference. Published lanes get watched. Unpublished lanes are just routes nobody's written down. They still exist. Prethis's dermis went a shade grayer. Drivathi noted that he did not immediately follow with another question, which meant the answer had been more than he expected. She moved forward before the pause could become something the human would register. Your summary also claims 17 successful evacuations without civilian casualty. The time period listed is 11 months. That is a high frequency. 43 people per convoy average, Nora said. 17 convoys, 731 total. No fatalities. She said it the way a contractor might quote a materials estimate, just a figure she had arrived at through practice and repetition, and now lived in her memory with the comfortable weight of something verified. The last 3 ran concurrent because we had the routes memorized well enough to split the planning load between myself and my colleague, Corporal Adisa. He ran routes 7 through 11 on the northern arc. I ran the southern. The name Adisa landed on the table like something dropped from a distance. Drivathi recognized it. Her staff would recognize it. Corporal Marcus Adisa had been the subject of 3 separate council briefings over the past 8 months and had accumulated, in that time, a reputation that made senior fleet strategists involuntarily straighten their posture when his name appeared in a document. The briefings had covered the Denveth Station situation, the Keller's Rock standoff, and most recently, an incident near the Raxian transit hub that 4 different commanders had each filed separate after-action reports about, all 4 of which used the word unprecedented at least once, and 2 of which used it twice. The fact that this human knew him well enough to split a planning operation with him and referenced him the way one might reference a trusted colleague rather than a decorated figure, produced a very small and precise recalibration in Drivathi's working model of the woman across the table. "You know Corporal Adisa," she said. It was not quite a question. 11 months in a Scraith occupation corridor, Nora said. You get to know people. Sithari, the junior analyst at the end of the table, a young Raxian who had been hired 2 months prior specifically for her ability to cross-reference disparate data sources quickly, made a very small movement. Her stylus tapped the corner of her data pad twice, which was the gesture she made when she was filing something away under a category she had not previously had to create. Sub-Coordinator Vethis, the senior logistics specialist on Drivathi's staff, set her data pad down. Vethis was a Solvati, and the particular angle at which she placed the pad, squared to the table edge with exaggerated precision, communicated what she was not going to say aloud, which was, "I need a moment to reconsider my prior assessment." The Keith corridor is significantly larger in scope than the Scraith Occupation Zone transit network, she said, when she had re-squared the pad to her satisfaction. 43 installations. Populations ranging from 2,000 to approximately 140,000 per installation. Phyraxian approach vectors are not yet confirmed, which means any evacuation route map now may be invalidated when actual fleet movement data becomes available. I know, Nora said. Vethis waited, apparently for more. The human did not offer more. That is a significant operational uncertainty, Vethis said. The pause that followed was pointed, her way of indicating that she expected the human to address the significance. All route planning is, the human said. That's not a problem with the Keth planning specifically. That's just what the work is. You build the best map you can with what you have, you keep 3 alternates for every primary, and when the data changes, you update. The map isn't the route. The map is a record of how you thought about the route at a specific point in time. The room was very quiet for a moment. Drivathi recognized that quality of quiet. She had heard it twice before, both times in rooms where a human was in the process of saying something that the room had not been prepared to hear. The previous 2 times, it had preceded a statistic. This time, it had preceded a methodology, and methodologies, in her experience, took longer to absorb because they changed the shape of the problem rather than just the size of it. Walk me through your methodology, she said. Specifically, not in general terms, concretely, as if you were planning the Keth corridor right now. The human looked at her for a beat, and there was something in that look that Drivathi could not categorize precisely. Something that might have been appreciation, or might have been the careful attention of a person deciding which part of a large answer fits the space available. Then, Nora uncurled her hands, reached into her jacket pocket and placed a folded physical paper on the table. Paper. Actual physical paper, which no one used in formal council proceedings, which was the material equivalent of a statement about methodology before a single word of explanation had been offered. Prithas's dermis shifted decisively gray. Vethis stared at the paper as though it were a navigation instrument she had not seen deployed before, which, in a sense, it was. In the occupation zone, data pads could be traced, Nora said. Signals intercept. So we mapped physically. I still do the first pass by hand because it forces you to think about the route instead of thinking about the interface. She unfolded the paper. It was dense with small notations, geometric and layered, radiating from a central hub with numbered alternates branching in clusters of 3, each cluster annotated with what appeared to be timing figures and capacity notes written in a compact hand. This is a partial sketch of the Keith Northern Arc. I did this 3 days ago from the publicly available infrastructure data in the Council database. The primary route I'd recommend for the 4 largest installations runs through the secondary transit relays on vectors 11, 14, and 22. Here. She turned the paper so the room could see. Her finger traced a line. The published evacuation guidance for those installations uses the main corridor transit lanes. She continued, her tone unchanged, the same flat declarative she had used to count convoys. Which is fine if you assume a Vraxian approach from the galactic south. If they push from the east, which the fleet movement data from the past 6 months suggests is at least a 40% possibility, those lanes pass directly through what would become an active interdiction zone. These secondary relay routes stay north of the projected interdiction band, regardless of approach vector. They add 4.7 standard hours to the transit time for the largest installation. That is, in my assessment, an acceptable cost given the alternative. She refolded the paper and placed it back in her jacket pocket. The silence that followed was not the same silence as before. It was heavier and shaped differently. Prethus had ceased any pretense of studying his datapad. Vethus was watching the pocket where the paper had disappeared with the focused attention of someone who wanted to ask to see it again and was deciding whether asking would be appropriate. Sithari was writing, her stylus moving quickly now. Dravathi was doing arithmetic in her head, running the directional probability the human had just cited against what she knew of Vraxian expansion doctrine, and the number was matching, and the secondary relay route logic was matching, and the paper in the pocket had sketched a conclusion that 3 senior fleet strategists sitting on the actual evacuation committee had not yet published in any document she had reviewed. 4.7 hours, she said, for the Harath installation. That's the largest. The others are shorter because they're closer to the relay junction. The human paused. The published guidance assumes everyone leaves together on a single-stage movement. I wouldn't do it that way. I'd stagger the departures. The relay infrastructure can handle 1 installation at a time comfortably, or 2 at reduced efficiency. You try to push 4 at once, you get bottlenecks at the relay handoff points. You're not saving time. You're saving administrative simplicity, which is not the same thing. Prethus made a sound, very low, the Kaldrathi equivalent of a breath held and then released. His dermis, Dravathi noted, was no longer gray. It had shifted to a pale blue that indicated active intellectual engagement, the specific shade he produced when a problem he had been working on quietly reorganized itself in his mind. The staggered departure model introduces a different vulnerability, he said. His tone had shifted too. The formal register of an objection proceeding replaced with the register of a specialist talking to someone he had decided, provisionally, might know something worth discussing. The first installations to evacuate do so under the lowest threat pressure. The last installations to evacuate do so under the highest. You are concentrating risk in the tail end of the sequence. Yes, the human said. Prethus waited. The human waited. You have a solution for that, he said. You reverse the sequence, she said. You start with the installations closest to the projected approach vector. They go first, under the highest threat pressure, but they also have the shortest route to the relay junction and therefore the fastest transit. You're using their geographic position as partial compensation for their threat exposure. The installations deepest inside the corridor go last, under lower threat pressure, but they have more time to load and stage. By the time the situation has progressed far enough for them to be genuinely at risk, the tail end of their transit is already in the safe zone. Prethis sat back. Vethis leaned forward. Sithari's stylus stopped moving, and she looked at the human with the particular arrested expression of a person who has just heard a piece of reasoning answer, a question they had been carrying for weeks without naming it. Dravathi felt her own secondary appendages shift involuntarily into the neutral fold position she used when she needed her hands still to think. She kept them there. "How long did it take you to develop this approach?" she asked. "About 11 months, the human said. Give or take. In the occupation zone. Moving real people through real space with a real adversary trying to stop me, yes." The human said it without any particular weight, just a description of the environment, the same register she used for everything. Theory is faster to develop than practice. I'd worked out the basic staggering logic on paper by month 3. The relay bottleneck problem didn't become obvious until month 7, when we had a near miss at the Kelith handoff point that cost us 6 hours of transit time because 2 convoys arrived at the junction simultaneously and the relay couldn't process them. She paused. Nobody was hurt. We lost 6 hours. After that, I added junction timing calculations to the standard route package for every subsequent convoy. The near miss at the Kelith handoff point. Dravathi filed that away, not because it was a data point she would need to verify, she would, but because the way it had been delivered told her something about how the woman's mind organized experience. Not as a failure, not as a crisis, as an information source that had updated a methodology. The computational affect of a person who processed what happened in order to use it, kept moving, and did not slow down to perform distress about it. The committee you've requested assignment to, Dravathi said, has been operational for 4 months. They have a substantial working framework already developed. Coming in at this stage with a different analytical approach is not simply additive. It creates friction. The people on that committee have seniority and institutional authority. Commander Yeth filed one of the 3 objections to your assignment. I know, Nora said. You are not troubled by that. The human's expression shifted very slightly, and Dravathi still could not determine whether the slight shift at the corner of her mouth was an almost smile or something else entirely. I'm troubled by the 43 installations, she said. The friction is a logistical problem. Logistical problems have solutions. The wrong route has different consequences. Vethis made a sound that Dravathi recognized with some surprise as the Solvathi equivalent of reluctant agreement. A low exhale with a specific pitch that Solvathi produced when they had reached a conclusion they had not intended to reach. She had heard it from Vethis 3 times in 4 cycles of working together, each time following a situation where the evidence had moved faster than Vethis's institutional caution had wanted to allow. Dravathi looked at Nora Vasquez directly, the way you looked at someone when you were deciding what they actually were, and the administrative framework for that decision had ceased to be useful. The human held the look, without reaction, just waiting, hands loose on the table, the most settled person in a room that had spent the past hour being systematically reorganized by her. Your assignment request listed the Keth Corridor Evacuation Planning Committee, Dravathi said. It did not specify a role within that committee. No, the human said. What role were you anticipating? Nora Vasquez looked at the wall to the left of the door for 1 second, the same wall she had been watching when Dravathi arrived, and then looked back. Secondary navigator, if they'll have me. I'm not trying to replace the existing framework. The basic structure they've built is sound. The relay routing and departure sequencing are where I think I can contribute." She paused. "If the primary route assumptions hold, I won't have much to do. If they don't, I'll have mapped the alternates." Drivathi looked at that wall. She had never thought to wonder what was behind it. The briefing room was on the station's eastern corridor, which meant the wall to the left of the door faced the void between stations, the long open space where transit lanes ran and where the Vraxian expansion fleet was somewhere in the process of deciding which direction to move. She looked at the wall and understood, with the particular clarity of an inference that arrives complete, that the human had sat in this room for at least 11 minutes before the session began, and had spent some portion of that time thinking about what was on the other side. The session ran for another hour and 40 minutes. It was, in Drivathi's considered estimation, the most substantive single exchange her division had conducted in 2 cycles of operation, including both prior human debriefings, including the Denveth Station Review, including the Joint Committee session with the Outer Council delegation that had run 8 hours and produced 6 pages of contested findings. Those sessions had produced conclusions. This one produced a methodology, which was a different thing because conclusions answered the question you had asked, and methodologies answered questions you had not thought to ask yet. Sub-coordinator. Prethis engaged the human for 45 minutes on the relay bottleneck calculations before Drivathi redirected the session back to the formal review. He had stopped being a proceduralist and started being an analyst somewhere between the 40% probability and the reverse sequencing explanation, and the transition had been so gradual that Drivathi suspected he had not noticed it himself. He filed a formal withdrawal of his objection at the session's conclusion. The withdrawal document included 2 paragraphs of technical notes about junction capacity modeling that were not required by the withdrawal form, but that Drivathi read carefully because they told her Prethis had been running his own calculations during the session and had arrived at the same destination the human had arrived at, working from a different direction. Sub-coordinator Vethis requested a copy of the partial route sketch before the human had gathered her jacket from the chair. Nora photographed the paper with a data pad and transmitted it immediately, without being asked twice, which suggested she had known the request was coming before it was made. Vethis had her own data pad open and was annotating the transmitted image before Nora had finished buttoning the jacket. She was making notes in the detailed shorthand she used when she intended to work something through seriously, not the cursory notation of someone cataloging for the record. Sithari sent Drivathi a brief message from across the table 3 minutes before the session formally closed. It read, "The relay sequencing model." Did the fleet committee see this? Drivathi did not have an answer. She suspected not, and the suspicion settled into the chest and stayed there. The formal objections from the 3 division heads were, by the end of that afternoon, withdrawn or suspended. 2 of the withdrawals came with attached notes that Drivathi could only describe as conciliatory in tone. The 3rd came with a request that the human be briefed on the committee's existing route modeling before her first session, on the grounds that getting her up to speed quickly was now clearly in the committee's interest. That note was written by Commander Yeth, the xenoarchaeologist who specialized in Vraxian territorial doctrine, a species with an extremely low institutional tolerance for admitting that a prior assessment had been incorrect. The fact that he had written that request in those terms, without any of the hedging language he normally deployed in written correspondence, told Drivathi something about how the 40% probability and the paper sketch had landed when they made their way up the reporting chain. They would have reached him the same day. Prethis always filed his session notes before end of cycle. The evacuation planning committee held its first session with Nora Vasquez 9 days later. Drivathi was not in the room. She did not need to be. What came back through the standard reporting channels had the flavor of a document written by people who were choosing their language carefully, which is to say, people who had been surprised and were processing it in the register of formal record keeping. The phrases she noted included proposed significant modifications to the primary departure sequencing and challenged the relay routing assumptions in the northern arc with reference to infrastructure data not previously incorporated into the committee's working model. The report concluded with a line that struck her as unusually honest for the format, which was, "The committee is in the process of integrating the revised approach." Integrating. Present progressive. Still happening. The framework was being rebuilt around a different set of assumptions, the way you rebuild a structural load calculation when you discovered the weight distribution was wrong, keeping what had been correct, rerouting what the new information had made obsolete, not discarding the prior work but reorganizing it around a different center. 6 weeks after Nora Vasquez joined the committee, the Vraxian expansion fleet shifted its approach vector from south to east. It was not quite 40% probability. It was 38, according to the post-movement analysis that circulated through the Council's strategic channels. Close enough that the number in Drivathi's memory, said in the flat declarative register of a woman who made her first pass at any map by hand, held its shape without distortion. It had not been a guess. It had been an estimate based on 6 months of fleet movement data that its author had clearly reviewed before walking into a contested assignment review and sitting for 11 minutes in a room that smelled like recycled coolant and something organic she could not identify. The primary routes on the published evacuation guidance passed through the interdiction band. The routes through the secondary transit relays on vectors 11, 14, and 22 did not. Drivathi reviewed the updated evacuation movement plan 10 days after the Vraxian vector shift was confirmed. It was substantially different from the version current when Nora joined. The departure sequence ran in reverse order of geographic proximity to the projected approach vector, with staggered timing intervals calculated to the relay junction capacity of each handoff point. A notation in the document's metadata indicated the departure sequencing model had been contributed by a secondary navigation advisor, and there was a reference citation attached pointing to a prior session working document that contained, rendered in digital form but traceable by its geometry, to something drawn by hand, the original sketch from a jacket pocket. She sent Nora Vasquez a message. Brief. It read, "The committee's revised plan was approved today. The northern arc routing is being implemented. The departure sequencing will be run as proposed." The response came 4 hours later. It said, "Good. I mapped 2 more alternates for the Herath installation in case the primary relay at junction 14 sees higher traffic than projected. I'll have them filed by end of cycle. No acknowledgement of the vector shift or what it would have meant for 731 people multiplied by 43 installations. No comment on the approval. Just the next map. Just the contingency she was already preparing for, the problem that had not yet arrived, but that she had presumably assessed a probability for and sketched on paper before filing in a pocket. Drivathi requested the maintenance report for the Eastern Corridor 2 days after that. Out of a curiosity she could not entirely account for professionally. The smell she had never identified was trace atmospheric compound from a hydroponics bay, 3 corridors over. Perfectly harmless. A product of ordinary growing things doing what ordinary growing things do in enclosed spaces. She had assumed it was the biology lab for 6 cycles without ever checking, because the assumption was close enough to workable, and the room had other things in it that needed her attention. The hydroponics bay grew something with pale greenish flowers that bloomed on a 12-day cycle. She looked at the maintenance report for longer than necessary. She thought about all the things she had assumed she knew the source of, all the faint presences she had filed under probable cause without checking, all the conclusions she had assigned to nearby categories because they were plausible and the work was plentiful and verification had seemed redundant. She thought about a woman who drew maps by hand because the interface made you think about the interface. She thought about 11 minutes in a room facing outward and what a person thinks about when they face a wall that has something on the other side of it. The evacuation movement was still ongoing. 43 installations in the Keth corridor, moving in the sequence that matched the sketch on the piece of paper, which matched the geometry of the space they were moving through, which matched the direction the Varaxian fleet had actually moved. Somewhere in the corridor, right now, the last installations were loading. Junction 14 was handling traffic. The alternates were filed for the contingency that might still arrive. The hydroponics bay bloomed every 12 days. No one had mentioned it to her. It had been there the whole time. She shut down her data pad and sat with that thought in the recycled coolant and hydroponics smell of the building where she worked, in the room where a quiet woman had waited 11 minutes facing a wall and been underestimated by everyone who walked in after her. And then she went back to work. The movement status reports came in daily for the next 3 weeks. Drivathi read each one the morning it arrived before she opened anything else on her data pad, which was not standard practice for an overseer whose portfolio included 14 active committees and whose mornings were normally sequenced by institutional priority. The Keth corridor reports were not technically in her portfolio any longer. The contested assignment review had been closed when the final objection was withdrawn, but she read them anyway because she was invested in a way she had not quite managed to name yet. The first week went smoothly. The closest installations to the projected approach vector, the 4 that Nora had flagged as highest geographic risk, completed their evacuation transit in the sequence the revised plan specified. The relay junctions handled the load within the capacity projections. No bottlenecks, no cascade delays, no missed handoff windows. Drivathi noted each clean transit in the way you note the absence of a problem you had been genuinely braced for. The second week produced the first complication. Installation 12, a mid-sized mining colony of 11,000, was 6 hours behind schedule on staging because of a dispute among the Colony Governance Council about which cargo class to prioritize. The delay propagated into the Junction 14 timing window and pushed Installation 13's departure slot back by 4 hours. Drivathi read that report with the specific alertness of someone watching for the moment when a framework gets tested, because frameworks that had never been tested were theoretical, and the Keth plan had been theoretical from the moment it was drawn on paper. The following morning's report indicated that the delay had been absorbed. The 4-hour gap in the Junction 14 window had been filled by moving Installation 15's pre-staging sequence forward, which worked because 15 was deep enough in the corridor that its departure time had buffer built into it. The note attached to that section of the report said only, "Schedule recovered." The notation attributed the revised staging sequence to the secondary navigation advisor. Drivathi read that line 3 times. Then she read it once more. The secondary navigation advisor had anticipated a staging delay at Installation 12, or something like it, which was why Installation 15 had buffer built into its pre-staging sequence to begin with, and the buffer had absorbed exactly the size of problem that manifested. The map had not been for the route as planned. The map had been for the route as it would actually behave. She thought about a piece of paper with numbered alternates branching in clusters of 3. She thought about the Kelith handoff point in month 7 of an 11-month deployment, a near miss that cost 6 hours, and what a person did with that information afterward. She thought about the fact that the paper had existed for 3 days before the contested assignment review, meaning Nora had drawn it before she knew whether she would be allowed in the room, before she knew whether the institutional objections would hold, before she knew anyone would ever look at it. She had made the map because the map needed to exist. The rest of it, the session, the objections, the approval, was secondary infrastructure. Sathari stopped by Drivathi's office on the 17th day of the Keth movement, which was a Tuesday by the station's operational calendar, and a day when the lower deck cafeteria ran an Aldrin grain dish that Sathari ate, without fail, every cycle. The fact that she had passed the cafeteria route to come here first told Drivathi the visit was intentional. Sathari was 23 cycles old and had been with the division for 2 months, and had the particular quality of young analysts who took good ideas more personally than institutional process allowed. "The Harath transit is tomorrow," Sathari said. Harath was the largest installation in the Keth corridor, 140,000 people, the one with the 4.7-hour transit time through the secondary relay, the one the original guidance would have routed through the interdiction band if the Varaxian fleet had moved as it moved. "I know," Drivathi said. Sathari looked at the data pad in her hand and then up, in the way she did when she was deciding whether to say the thing she had actually come to say. She said it. If the original routing had been used, Junction 8 would have been the primary handoff point for Harath. Junction 8 is currently inside the confirmed interdiction band. "I know," Drivathi said. Sathari nodded once and left. She was back at her own desk before the cafeteria opened, which meant she had been on time for the Aldrin grain dish after all, and Drivathi sat with the number 140,000 for a few minutes, in the way you sat with a number that refused to stay abstract. The Harath transit ran 19 hours. Drivathi tracked it through the status updates, which came every 6 hours, and each update arrived with the particular cleanness of a process unfolding within its projected parameters. Secondary relay junction 11, clear. Handoff to vector 14 relay, on schedule. Final arc to the safe zone, 19 hours and 12 minutes. 12 minutes over projection, well within the buffer. 140,000 people, the last installation in the corridor, through the secondary relay route and into the safe zone before the Varaxian interdiction line had advanced far enough to matter. The final status report for the Keth corridor evacuation was 23 pages long and written in the formal language of committees that have completed a task they had not been certain they would complete. The summary section ran 4 paragraphs. Drivathi read the 3rd paragraph twice because it noted that the departure sequencing model and relay routing framework developed during the committee's operational period had been formally recommended for adoption as standard protocol for analogous multi-installation corridor evacuations, with attribution to the planning methodology contributed by the secondary navigation advisor. Standard protocol. She thought about what standard protocol meant, the way a piece of reasoning became load-bearing for the next situation, then the one after that. She thought about 11 months in a Scraith occupation corridor and the routes nobody had written down yet. She thought about a methodology that had gone from occupied zone to paper sketch to contested assignment review to committee framework to standard protocol in the span of 7 weeks, in the way that good ideas travel when someone has the patience to hold them until the room is ready. She sent one more message to Nora Vasquez. It said, "The Harath transit completed 19 hours 12 minutes. All 43 installations clear. The committee has recommended the departure sequencing model for standard adoption. I thought you should know." The response came the next morning. It said, "Good. I'm attached to a planning team for the Dreven cluster now. Different setup, fewer installations, longer relay gaps. I've been reading their existing framework. Some of it will hold. I'll let you know what needs work." Drevathy read the message and looked at her office wall, which faced the station's interior and had nothing behind it except an corridor and offices and the ordinary machinery of a station going about its work. She thought about what it would take to look at a wall and see the thing on the other side of it, to hold the space between what was mapped and what would actually happen, and work in that gap, patiently, every day, without needing anyone to acknowledge that the gap existed until the gap itself provided the evidence. The hydroponics bay 3 quarters over had bloomed twice since she found out about it. She still passed it every morning on the way to the briefing room and smelled what she now knew was pale greenish flowers on a 12-day cycle, doing something useful, very quietly, without waiting to be asked. Some things, she'd come to think, were like that.